All right, guys, welcome to my third lecture on World War II, my final lecture. I just had a bit of a nightmare. I recorded this lecture, and for the first time, didn't actually record it, malfunctioned. So that kind of sucks. But I'm going to give it a go again here. Right, so where do we leave off? We left off here with the Battle of the Atlantic. We'll pick it up from here. Right, so the greatest turning point of World War II. Different opinions on this. I'm pretty convinced it's the Battle of Stalingrad. It is not the Battle of the Atlantic. It is certainly not the Battle of Britain, which has been much exaggerated by British propaganda. Yep, there we go. My old bias against the British. But think about it. The Battle of Britain really just meant the survival of democracy in Britain, survival against the Nazi threat. And yes, that's a big deal. However, it is not an offensive move. After the Battle of Britain, the Germans are still fully in command of the continent of Europe. They've eventually successfully conquered Europe. This, on the other hand, the Battle of Stalingrad, is a total reversal. Now, the Germans had a three-pronged attack, marched through Russia, inflicting terrible things on the Russians as they went. We won't get into too much detail, not a world history course, but we know this. We know they left devastation wherever they went, that they treated the Slavic peoples, the Russians, in a terrible way, killing people, Einsatzgruppen, assassination squads, killing large numbers of Jews, Russian Jews, but really indiscriminately massacring Russians. Millions dead. They got to three cities, Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. The three greatest cities in Russia. If these fell, the war was over, effectively, in Russia. Now, they did not conquer any of the three. They got to the doorsteps of all three. Sieges, battles. It was an extraordinary resistance by the Russians. It is to be said, though, that Hitler messed up big time at Stalingrad. He refused his commander on the ground, Friedrich von Paulus, from retreating, and in doing so, they were encircled, and the Nazis lost 250,000 men at Stalingrad. After this, the Germans knew nothing but defeat. The Russians started pushing them back. The new factories that had been built beyond the Urals, from these were unleashed the new Tiger tanks, and the Russians began to push back against the Germans again and again, until, of course, the Russians moved into Germany itself. So, meanwhile, what's happening? We talked the last day about the Americans and the British defeating the Germans in North Africa and Italians. They move on to the Italian mainland. Progress is slow. Italy is a very mountainous country, and therefore there's only certain avenues by which one can proceed up along the coast. And the Italians, really marshaled by some German divisions, slowed down the Italians. Very long story regarding the fate of Mussolini. He's deposed. He is rescued by German paratroopers. He's installed as the puppet of a northern Italian state. He's a broken man at this stage, but eventually, towards the end of the war, he is captured by the communist partisans, and he is murdered alongside his mistress, Clara Petacci. His body is hung from a piazza in Milan. Okay. Now, meanwhile, while all this is going on, the big three are meeting to discuss their plans for the war, their plans for the post-war world. And the big three, of course, would France is not included. France knocked out of the conflict in the early stages. Vichy France, a puppet state run by the Germans, German allies, Marshal Pétain, and all that business. So the big three, who are they? Of course, it's Russia, the United States, and Britain. The closeness of the relationship between FDR and Churchill has been overstated. There was certainly a warmth, a commitment there in the early part of the war. However, FDR, when he went to these conferences, did not share Churchill's hostility and coldness for Stalin. FDR wanted to cultivate this relationship for the benefit of the United States during that conflict. And there was becoming quite apparent about Stalin and FDR that for all Churchill's charisma and for all Churchill's bluster, that ultimately the British were in very significant decline, and therefore Churchill found himself being isolated. There is a certain criticism of FDR and Churchill for not pushing back stronger against Russia in Eastern Europe. But we have to keep in mind here that the fact was that Russia suffered the greatest casualties at the hands of the Germans. And it was also the Russians who inflicted 90% of Germany's casualties. So therefore, when Russia, quotation marks, liberated Eastern Europe, in other words, installed their own puppet regimes in places from Romania to Poland, there's very little Allies could do about it. Very little Britain and America could do about it. So they basically allowed it to happen. What else could they do? Now, another advantage that Stalin possessed over his erstwhile allies was that he was the only one of the three to actually see out the war. Sadly, FDR died in office at the very beginning of his fourth term, unprecedented fourth term in office. 3 terms is unprecedented. He was replaced by Harry Truman. Harry Truman had only been vice president for that fourth term for just a couple of months. Meanwhile, in Britain, after victory in Europe, Churchill was promptly dumped out of office in favor of the Labour leader Clement Attlee. Why that was is a story for another day. But the point being is that Stalin, these guys were relatively neophytes, both were very talented men actually, but Stalin had an advantage in that respect too because he had longevity, he had seniority in this relationship. And the relationship between Truman and Stalin quickly deteriorated. Now, the D-Day landings. D-Day landings. Get a drink of water. That's what happens when you record a lecture twice in a row. So, yes, the D-Day landings. Movies like Saving Private Ryan, well, that movie particularly, has given the impression that the D-Day landings came at a terrible cost. This is not actually the case. The D-Day landings were a total triumph, with the exception of one beach. And that was the beach on which the movie revolves around, at the beginning of the movie anyway, Omaha Beach, held and taken by the Americans. Taken, I should say. The other 4 beaches, we see here the map on the left, taken by Americans, the British, and the Canadians. We do forget about the Canadians. All went smoothly, relatively smoothly. They were a triumph. They were a triumph of coordination, planning. The use of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines to cut off those support lines so that the Germans could not rush troops to where they were needed. Remember, the Germans did not know where this invasion was going to happen. We have secrecy. We have effective support from the air, from bombers. We have support from battleships, destroyers. It's a triumph. It sets up a more difficult journey through France, but ultimately, once this happens, Hitler's days are numbered because now he is having to resist the British and the Americans from the west and the Russians from the east. It is the Russians who win the race to Berlin. Now, here's a video that I recommend watching. It's called Downfall. It's a very famous scene in which Hitler basically loses it. I think it is the actor Bruno Ganz. But anyway, it's just a wonderful scene. I've been parodied many times. It's not compulsory to watch this. It's not needed for this course. But, you know, it's worth a watch. Now, as the Americans pour into Germany, they begin to stumble across the camps. And the elation, the joy of victory, the relief of victory gives way to, well, you guys should watch these videos and check them out for yourselves. I mean, the genocide, it is the most famous genocide in world history, the most infamous. It's a very well-known story. It's covered in readings in elementary and middle school and high school. That doesn't take away from the impact of it. I think these are worth watching, and I'm going to put in a Google form question about these videos. Meanwhile, the Pacific, war in the Pacific. This conflict's ongoing. This conflict is ongoing. It is not the initial focus. There is an agreement between the Americans, the British, and the Russians, but the focus would be on defeating Germany. But the war in the Pacific is ongoing. What will this war look like? What unique challenges did the war in the Pacific present? It is undoubtedly the case that these challenges revolved around the landscape and the nature of Japanese resistance. Now, a landscape, of course, we mean a waterscape. To get to the Japanese home islands, you've got to get across the greatest ocean in the world, with only small islands, often very small islands, rocky outcrops that you have to take from the Japanese to get closer, what we call the island hopping campaign. So let's talk more about that, the island hopping campaign. What could the Americans expect there? Well, what we find is that the Japanese are prepared for the American onslaught. They are dug into these islands. They are well trained. They're well armed, well equipped, and of course, known for their great determination. Now, I did forget to say, let me just go back here. I did want to mention here that before we really get into the Japanese being on the defensive, you do have the great Battle of Midway. The Japanese had hoped to essentially knock the United States out of the war at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese mentality had been that the Americans would not endure, the American people would not be able to sustain a long war against the Japanese, and therefore they would come to a negotiated settlement. That proved to be a wholly inaccurate assessment of the American character. But let's talk now about the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway, you can see here, aptly named Midway, really was the greatest naval confrontation of the war. Now, this is a naval confrontation including aircraft carriers, one of the great innovations of the era. The Japanese put it all into this battle, huge resources, and they lost. They lost in a big way. And after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Air Force and the Japanese Navy was never able to countenance another offensive move against the Americans. Back to the Japanese character I mentioned. There is a tendency to think of the Japanese in World War II as wildly fanatical. Where does that come from? What truth is there in that? Well, they were extraordinarily dedicated. And this stems from the Japanese honor code. And, you know, it's a real thing. It stems back to the Japanese samurai culture. I was able to witness this firsthand in a strange way when I lived in Japan in 2002. The Japanese honor system. I remember some students misbehaving in class. As the rest of the students all behaved and ignored these students, I asked my mentor teacher afterwards, why was it that we hadn't disciplined these errant students? And the reply of my mentor teacher, Yasumori sensei, was to say that their punishment is their shame. And that's a major part of Japanese culture. And so therefore the Japanese thought it shameful to surrender, shameful to give up, and therefore they resisted to the bitter end. However, we should also add that Japanese propaganda from the government had painted the Americans as savages and had warned the soldiers that if they were captured by American forces, that they would be tortured. And therefore it was better to fight to the bitter end, and if necessary, to take one's own life. However, I do want to point out here that the Japanese were also well trained, great coordination, and they certainly weren't wild in any way. Now, probably the most iconic symbol of Japanese resistance kamikaze pilots. But I do want to make a point about the kamikaze here. I think it's important to bear in mind. The kamikaze were used to crash through and destroy wooden decks of American battleships and aircraft carriers. They were initially successful when used. However, they were soon proven ineffective when the Americans began to reinforce the decks of their ships and uh, equip their ships with more anti-aircraft guns. The kamikaze in themselves were a tactic of desperation, and the Japanese only turned to them when their existing air force was practically wiped out in battles such as Midway. And so the Japanese would never have wasted trained pilots in this fashion. So these guys really were not trained pilots at all. They just knew how to take off and basically wreck the plane. So that's one thing worth noting with the kamikaze. Of course, the cost of the war in the Pacific was huge. I don't have the figures on me right now, but this was a deadly conflict. And this was even before the Japanese home islands had been invaded. This was possibly going to cost millions of American dead. And so Harry Truman took a fateful decision. He decided, after basically suddenly being thrust into the office of president, after only being vice president for a couple of months, he was made aware of the Manhattan Project. He was made aware of the potential to drop a nuclear weapon, and he decided to embrace it. This is a very controversial decision. Many people conclude today that morally it was wrong. Certainly morally, it's highly dubious. However, it is an understandable decision. Understandable. Why is it understandable? Well, look at the accompanying documents. Get another view on it. Get Truman's view on this. And I think we can see that there's two sides to this argument. But even on the American side, there is certainly grave reservations. Here we have on the right Robert Oppenheimer, who is head of the Manhattan Project. In this video, you can see how he's really torn by the whole event. So look at that video as well. Los Alamos Project that brought the Manhattan Project that made the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki a reality, spoke to the incredible power of the federal government and the expansion of the federal government in the 20th century, a theme for our course, which I have really emphasized. Here is the dropping of the bomb. Again, great documentary, well worth watching. So this brings us towards the end of our lecture, the death totals. What can we say about the death totals? Well, people are often drawn to two things. The death rate of the Soviet Union and the death rate of China, and then a relatively low death rate of the United States. Of course, the reason why the death rate in the US is relatively low, and bear in mind, these are still very significant numbers of American dead. But the war is not fought in the United States, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, and therefore civilians are not dying. The majority of casualties in World War II are civilians. The carnage of the modern machines of war, the inhumane attitude that the Japanese and the Germans have in terms of the Chinese and the Russians is really beyond belief. Terrible atrocities. Therefore, life was cheap. The Chinese figures, let's keep in mind too, that the war had been raging for a decade in China, ever before Pearl Harbor occurred. It was a triangular war. The Chinese communists trying to overthrow, effectively they eventually did, the nationalist government of China, meanwhile being invaded from the east by the Japanese. Terrible episodes in that conflict. In the Soviet Union, again, awful things happening. There is no doubt that the vast majority of Russian dead were killed by the Germans. You might say, why do I mention this? Well, the thought process here is that there is also a percentage, how much we don't know. I can't put a figure on it. Is it 5%? I don't know, maybe 10% of those Russian dead might be attributable to Stalin. because before the war, we do know that Stalin was killing people in Russia who he suspected of opposing communism. We have the purges. I'm not going to get into all that, but to a certain extent, there's a slight overstatement. I say slight. Now, to finish up on this, of course, we lead into the Cold War. I'm not going to get into this. Just want to make sure that you're familiar with a couple of things. The idea being here that it is now the age of two new superpowers. Yes, Germany's been destroyed. Yes, France is defeated early in the war. Britain wins, right? Yeah, they win, sure. But also they're bankrupted by the war. Their empire is in decline. They suffer terribly during the conflict. And with the independence of India after the war, really the British Empire is finished. And it is a time for two great superpowers. They now are the United States and the Soviet Union. Need another drink of water here as to finish up. Now, just a couple of theories in this, a couple of points to make. It's undoubtedly the case that the Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe antagonized Britain and the United States. However, we must also say that the suspicion that the Soviets had of the British and the Americans was well founded, in that the Soviets had been isolated before the war, and of course there's a huge ideological clash. Now, final thoughts. We have here a couple of theories to finish the war with. The Truman Doctrine. Harry Truman, far less accepting, maybe accepting is not the right term, far less flexibility in terms of the Russians than FDR have been, quite simply because this is the end of the war. The Germans have been defeated. The Americans and Russians don't feel like they need each other anymore. The Truman Doctrine states the United States will support any peoples for trying to resist pressure from an outside force. Basically, a thinly veiled promise to support countries who are resisting a communist occupation. This is backed up with other ideas such as containment, the domino effect, the belief being that if communism is not stopped, it will spread to other nations. It appears that's already happened with China. It's happening in Vietnam at the end of the war. It seems to be happening in Korea. Therefore, the United States feels they have to stop this process. To back this up with the Marshall Plan, a really, truly, hugely successful economic support package. The United States putting $13 billion, and that's in late 1940s money, on the table to basically rebuild Western European countries, of course, on the basis that they would be both democratic and capitalist. And it's not just politically oriented and militarily oriented too. Economically, if you are a capitalist country like the United States, you need trading partners. You want trading partners, and you certainly don't want them to be communist. So that brings us to the end of our lecture, the end of my lectures. I've done 6 of them. Thank you to everyone who's watched them. Maybe some of you have watched all 6. I hope you have. That will be it. Or we're out on the lecture front. From now on, we'll be concentrating on DBQs, reviewing, brainstorming, getting ready for that AP exam. Remember to do the Google Form quiz. And of course, next Wednesday, your unit test. It's a timed writing. You will only get the test credit for that if you take it during that hour window. Thank you.